I love a good story. I love a good novel. I love a good film. I love a good penetrating social drama, and I love a good creative flight of fancy. I love a good science fiction, and I love a good horror movie too. The Shining, The Thing, The Exorcist. 3 very good horror films. I'd recommend all 3 to any lover of the horror genre. But there is good, there is very good, and then there is great. So what is it that, in my own subjective view, distinguishes a great horror movie from a good or even a very good one? For me, a good horror movie makes you feel. It makes you feel the horror. Any horror film that doesn't succeed in this has pretty much failed in its purpose. A great horror movie, in my own subjective book, also makes you think. What's this, you say? The Shining doesn't make you think? The Thing and The Exorcist don't make you think? There are endless videos to be found online in which fans of these films think heavily about them, sharing their own theories about what the various aspects of these stories mean. There's even an entire movie in its own right devoted to an analysis of The Shining. So for me to claim these films don't make you think is clearly not right, yes? Well, it's not that kind of thinking I'm talking about here. The thinking we engage in with films like The Shining and The Thing is puzzle box thinking. It's thinking for fun. What does it mean that Jack appears in a photograph at the end of The Shining? Is Macready or Charles the thing at the end of the movie? We enjoy sharing our theories with each other because it's fun. It's a puzzle to solve, or at least wrestle with. But puzzle box thinking isn't the kind of thinking I'm talking about when it comes to making a horror great. The thinking I'm talking about is that deeper reflection on the existential nature of being human, because that kind of thinking relates directly to each of us. None of us generally need to worry about how well we will be able to look after ourselves at the Overlook Hotel, or which of our friends may have been taken over by an extraterrestrial. Generally. So what about The Exorcist? Doesn't this one get us thinking deeply about the nature of things, such as the power of faith in the face of evil? I'd say The Exorcist is the least thinky of these 3 films. The story is really very cut and dry. The devil possesses a girl, and eventually a priest manages to save her through his own willing self-sacrifice. The girl's an innocent, the priest martyrs himself, and the devil, though he is denied his unwilling victim, does gain a willing victim. There's not really much that needs thinking about here. And I've just told a lie. I actually think The Exorcist could count as an existentially thinky film. The reason I don't want to count it is because I don't think the film itself intends this. Let me explain. The devil has always been portrayed as needing his victims to be willing, to submit to him by their own choice, in order for him to gain his victory over you. So, in The Exorcist, the devil gets what he was intending from the start. In The Exorcist, the devil wins. The ending of the film is as dark, if not darker, than all that went before it. But the story itself doesn't recognise this. The story wants us to admire the priest's sacrifice, see it as a win, a triumph of faith over evil. not see it as a defeat, which it actually is. And that's why I'm not going to count it. Few, if any, audience members, after watching The Exorcist, are inclined to reflect on their own unfortunate willingness to sacrifice themselves in their own lives, day in and day out. So we need to look elsewhere for the kind of horror I'm talking about, the true existential horror that does ask us to question our own self, question our own beliefs, perceptions and choices. Now, of my personal 3 great existential horror movies, I have to say that I prefer Angel Heart and Jacob's Ladder over The Last Temptation of Christ. Now, this isn't because I see The Last Temptation as being less existentially thinky than the other two. Quite the opposite. I think it's the most existentially challenging of all 3, and also the most horrific. It's only that Angel Heart and Jacob's Ladder achieve a balance that satisfies me more. Both of these films succeed in getting the viewer to feel the horror as the story progresses, while ultimately coming clean about their message at the end of the story. The Last Temptation of Christ, on the other hand, saves almost all of its horror for the closing scene, and even though it seems, to me at least, to try its hardest to reveal its true message at the end, I feel it fails, because I've never heard a single person who has analysed this film come remotely close to picking up on it. So let's get into it. Angel Heart, Jacob's Ladder, The Last Temptation of Christ. I think these 3 films really go together quite astonishingly well as a comprehensive existential horror trilogy. Spoilers for all 3 coming up right now. Angel Heart is about a guilty man who sees himself as innocent and ultimately takes an elevator ride to hell. Jacob's Ladder is about an innocent man who sees himself as guilty and ultimately climbs the stairs to heaven. The Last Temptation of Christ is about a version of Jesus who struggles with temptation throughout the story because he is unsure about what even constitutes temptation in the first place, and ultimately fails horrifically. So I'm about to spell out my thoughts on all this, but for those who are interested, you could stop watching this now, go watch all 3 films and see if you can predict what my conclusions are going to be. That might be a rewarding experience for those who enjoy analysing a good existential horror or 3. Okay, so here we go. So in Angel Heart, our protagonist is a man, a private investigator called Harry Angel, who does not remember that he has sold his soul to the devil. The devil, rather cheekily, hires Harry to find himself, to find the man that Harry has forgotten he is. At the end of the story, Harry solves the case, finally realising that he himself is the man he's been looking for, the one who sold his own soul for success and has committed many horrific acts against others. The film closes with him taking the elevator to hell. In giving us this story, the film invites us, the viewers, to ask ourselves, how often do we deceive ourselves about our own goodness? How selective do we allow our memory to become so that we may feel good about ourselves, so that we can feel we deserve and can expect love and good things for ourselves? And to what lengths are we prepared to go in order to preserve this self-deception? So this story can lead, if the viewer is inclined, after feeling all of the horror feels, to some deep existential self-examination. In Jacob's Ladder, our protagonist is Jacob, an American soldier of the Vietnam War who feels hideously guilty because his son was killed by a car and he wasn't able to save him. There was nothing he could have done to save his son, but he feels horribly guilty all the same. When Jacob and his squad are subjected to experimental chemicals designed for the US military to increase the aggression of its soldiers, Jacob hallucinates that he returns to civilian life and leaves the war behind. But he is plagued by demonic seeming characters and entities who seem intent on taking from him the people and things in the world he is attached to. Towards the end of the story, it is made clear that Jacob is still in Vietnam, and he has been dying all the way through the film. And the angels sent to help him release his attachments to his life so that he may ascend and be at peace, only appear to him as demons and bad people, because he is still holding on so desperately, holding on to his guilt and holding on to his material life. The story resolves with him finally feeling prepared to release those things, and he meets his dead son, who takes him to heaven. In giving us this story, the film invites us, the viewers, to ask ourselves, how much do we distort the world and the people around us when we are filled with our own remorse and self-loathing? How many innocent, angelic people do we paint as demonic in our own minds when we have come to be merciless in judging our own selves? So this story can lead, if the viewer is inclined, after feeling all of the horror feels, to some deep existential self-reflection. Which brings us to the last temptation of Christ. This film gives us the story of a version of Jesus who is significantly different from the kinds of depictions we are used to. The focus of this characterization is on his humanity, his imperfections. He still performs the occasional miracle, but these don't seem to help him have faith in himself and his role. This is a Jesus who hears voices in his head and is unsure if it's God or the devil. He is often morose and depressive and delivers sermons that are needy and histrionic. He believes he is the Messiah while doubting his own fitness for the task. He believes it is his destiny, it is God's wish, God's plan, that he be sacrificed for the good of all humankind, and he is, understandably, afraid. The main recurring theme for him throughout his journey is the idea that his desire for the love of a woman and the chance to raise a family with her can only be viewed as a temptation that he must resist if he is to be a good and worthy Messiah. Loving a woman and raising a family are incompatible with being the Christ, for reasons that are so clear and obvious that they never even need to be explained, beyond the certain and definitive edict that you do what God asks you to do, or you are an unworthy failure. He does his best throughout the film to resist this terrible temptation to unworthiness, but falls at the final hurdle when he is hanging from the cross. The devil shows up in the form of a young girl who claims to be his guardian angel, come to relieve him from his pain, telling him that God is happy with him and doesn't need for him to suffer anymore. She takes him down from the cross and grants him the happy family life he has always longed for. The final act of the film sees him live to an old age, and he does claim to be happy. Until good old Judas shows up at his deathbed and chastises him for his failure. Following this, Jesus begs God to return him to the cross to fulfill his destiny. So, why does this film qualify for inclusion in my 3 great existential horrors? Here comes my interpretation of The Last Temptation of Christ and my explanation for why it counts as truly great existential horror. To be honest, I'm not expecting a single person to be on board with me on this, but I'm always open to being pleasantly surprised. So, the devil crops up throughout the story in various guises and with various temptations, none of which seem to be particularly subtle. The devil crops up a good deal, and God not at all. In this film, we never see God, we never hear his voice. His presence, or at least his participation, is implied via the miracles, though these miracles seldom, if ever, are of a wholesome nature. Jesus pulls his heart out of his body. He turns water into alcohol. He reanimates the corpse of Lazarus. Is it God empowering Jesus to perform these unpleasant miracles? Or could it possibly be the devil? The final temptation that the devil offers, it doesn't seem to be any more subtle than those that have gone before. Come, Jesus, come down from that cross. Leave your suffering behind and have a woman and raise a family. When it comes to subtlety, the devil in this story is clearly not all that. Or is he? Jesus is seen clearly on a parchment that contains no writing, presented by a prophet whose face is hidden beneath a hood, that his task is to be sacrificed, and sacrificed willingly, for the greater good of humanity. If he achieves his task, humanity will be saved, released from its own sins by his example of self-sacrifice, the teaching of self-sacrifice. If he fails, then humanity will not be saved, and it will all be Jesus' fault. God does not show up in this film at all. God has no role, no starring part in this story, not even a cameo. There is Jesus, there is temptation, and there is the rest of humanity. The devil's plan is to get Jesus to believe he is doing God's work by spreading the message that self-sacrifice in the name of God is good. It is not just good, it is the very best thing ever. And it must be a willing self-sacrifice. The devil's plan in this story is that humanity itself comes to willingly sacrifice itself for a God that isn't there. The devil desires sacrifice, but more than anything, he desires that this be the willing self-sacrifice of all of us. He wishes for us to do his bidding as if it is our own. And it is only when Jesus, on the cross, feels abandoned by God that his willingness falters, this willingness to self-destruction that is all important to the devil's plan. Jesus' sacrifice is assured now. That's not in doubt. He's already up there on the cross. But his willingness for it is no longer there. And it is now that the devil plays his masterstroke. He plays his double bluff. Just as Jacob, dying and hallucinating in Vietnam, imagines himself being released from this torment and being allowed to return to civilian life and have a lover, so too does Jesus in this story, dying and hallucinating on the cross, imagine himself being released from his torment and being allowed to return to civilian life and have a lover and raise a family with her. And here's a really very interesting parallel between Jacob's ladder and the last temptation of Christ. When Jacob hallucinates that he is back home, he does not get to be with the mother of his children. He doesn't get to be with his wife. He gets a different lover, a surrogate for the love of his life. And this happens for Jesus also. When he hallucinates that he has returned to Mary Magdalene, she dies almost immediately, after a day or two, and Jesus has to go to a surrogate Mary to have the family life of his dreams. How interesting is that? There is only one woman in the world, says the devil, disguised as an angel to Jesus. One woman with many faces. Or in other words, all women are the same and it doesn't matter which one you get with. Go and have a good time. This is a pretty gross thing to say, and it clearly gives the devil away. It gives the devil away to the audience, though Jesus in the story accepts it meekly enough, and he says that he is happy with his family life. But he never actually looks that happy, nowhere near as happy as he would have been with Magdalene. But he's worn out and defeated. The fight has well and truly left him by this point. Why is the devil so heavy-handed here? Why does he give himself away in such an obvious manner? If he really wanted for Jesus to avoid his God-given responsibility of self-sacrifice by offering him a genuine temptation, then it would make perfect sense. It would make the most sense for him to let Jesus imagine his perfect family life with his perfect partner, the partner of his dreams, Mary Magdalene. But the devil doesn't do this. The devil gives himself away, deliberately. And this is the devil's double bluff. The devil really wishes for Jesus to hold on to his attachment to being the Messiah. The last thing that the devil wants in this story is the propagation of the message that having a loving spouse and being a loving spouse is a good thing. Having children and loving them is a good thing. The devil does not wish this for us. The devil wishes for sacrifice, willing self-sacrifice. The devil, who is temptation away from good things, wishes for us all to willingly sacrifice ourselves, perpetually, endlessly, not for God, but for him. The film itself hammers home the point that loving a woman and having children with her is a thing of weakness. In the closing part of the story, the devil calls on Judas to fulfill his traditionally appointed task of betrayal. Judas shows up and encourages Jesus to see himself as having failed the world because he chose a happy, wholesome life rather than one of suffering, torment and self-sacrifice. And Judas succeeds. The devil succeeds. Jesus begs God to return him to the cross so that he may suffer and die as he was supposed to, thereby ensuring that humanity will be inspired by his example to live good lives of suffering, torment, and self-sacrifice ourselves. Jesus believes he is saving the world. When he does reawaken on the cross, he believes he has accomplished his task. But it is a lie. And the thing about a lie is that it does not bring what it says it will bring. And the viewer of the film knows this full well, because the viewer of the film knows what Jesus doesn't. The viewer knows what goes on for humanity following his self-sacrifice, and it is not what Jesus had been told it would be. The Jesus on the cross, at the end of the last temptation of Christ, is a Jesus that has succumbed fully to temptation, a Jesus who speaks with the voice of the devil, so that all who believe in him may also speak for the devil, rejecting love and life in favour of self-denial and self-destruction, thereby securing the past 2,000 years of our shared history. When I watch The Last Temptation of Christ, it seems to me that the film is trying its very hardest to convey all of this to its audience. That the film doesn't succeed is not, in my opinion, the film's fault. It is ours. I watched an atheist and a Christian do a reaction to the film online together. Despite their ideological differences, these two guys are good friends who enjoy watching stuff together and then analysing it. What happened when it came to the bit where Jesus is on the cross and the angelic-looking girl appears is that both of them immediately hissed and referred to her as a snake, as the snake, because it was so obvious to them that she was here to tempt Jesus away from what they both knew was best for him and for the world. The film tries its best, in my view, but the story of the crucifixion is simply so well embedded into our collective psyche now that even the atheist immediately knew what he was supposed to think. I'd like to invite you to consider something. How about we take this story, keep all of the events the same, but change the names of the characters and set it in a different time and location. Let's call this story The Last Temptation of Gupta. At the beginning of the story, Gupta is a man who self-harms because he feels guilty about building torture devices for the colonists that have taken over his country, devices that will be used on his own people. He goes to visit the woman who he feels is the love of his life, but he must sit and wait and listen while a queue of men take turns having sex with her before he is able to talk to her and apologise for his own failings. She wants his love, support and protection, not his apologies. But Gupta is a man filled with his own self-doubt and self-loathing, so she's out of luck. Gupta is confused in himself because he hears voices in his head and can't decide whether it's the devil or God talking to him. He does not even consider the possibility that these voices may be his own. The story follows his struggles with his own confusion about who he is and what he is supposed to do. He tries to persuade the men around him that his role is to save the world because he has been chosen by God. The men believe he is probably crazy until he starts to perform miracles, such as pulling his heart from his body, turning water into alcohol, and reanimating corpses. Then they try to follow him, though it's challenging for them because he keeps changing his mind about what is most important and what his ultimate goal is. After seeing a prophecy on a blank sheet of parchment, Gupta decides that he must be sacrificed on one of the torture devices that he used to build. If he does this, then humanity will be saved from all of its own inherent badness, saved from its own sins. And indeed, it does come to pass that Gupta is sacrificed as he foresaw. While he dies, slowly in agony, he dreams of being saved by an angel who grants him the chance of a happy family life, with the love of his life. Unfortunately, his love dies before they can raise a family, and he has to settle for a surrogate. In the dream or hallucination, he lives to an old age, claiming to be happy, while hardly ever smiling. Finally, when he's on his deathbed, an old friend turns up and tells Gupta he is the lowest of traitors for not dying on the torture device and should be ashamed of himself. Gupta begs God to return him to his fate on the torture device because he feels so bad about his own weakness. Then he awakens from his dream, declares it is accomplished, and dies. The story ends there, but the audience knows that following the conclusion of Gupta's journey, things did not change for humanity. They probably got even worse. After watching The Last Temptation of Gupta, the audience will be in little doubt that they have just witnessed a tragic and twisted psychological horror. The Last Temptation of Christ is a fiction. It specifically goes out of its way to state this right at the beginning. It is a made-up story and does not pretend to be otherwise. But even atheists will find ways to justify their viewing it as an inspirational story, for no other reason than that the 5 letters of the protagonist's name are J-E-S-U-S rather than G-U-P-T-A. I invite some daring filmmaker to make The Last Temptation of Gupta, so that we may really see what we think of it as a story, our discernment unclouded by societal programming, unclouded by peer pressure. The reason that The Last Temptation of Christ is my least favourite of my 3 great existential horrors, but most definitely the most horrific, is because of the sheer existential horror that is crammed into its closing moments, and the fact that the film, despite its own best efforts, fails to keep the viewer from seeing this ending as a win. The film ultimately only overwhelmingly succeeds in doing to the viewer what the devil and Judas do to Jesus, and ultimately what Gupta did to himself, namely, come to view our own tortured self-sacrifice as a good thing, the very best of things. And we do this not just willingly, but eagerly, desperately.
It is accomplished!